All right, good evening, everybody, all of you here tonight, and welcome to the Boise City Planning and Zoning Commission public hearing. A few things to start out with for tonight's proceedings. Everyone from the public entering the hearing virtually has been automatically muted and cannot speak. As the item you're interested in comes up for discussion, you'll be called upon and unmuted. There is a chat function in Zoom. However, this is not part of the record and should only be used if technical difficulties arise. Our procedure for public hearings begins with a presentation from the planning team. Then we'll go to the applicant and then the representative of the Registered Neighborhood Association, followed by questions from the commission. After that, we proceed to public testimony, starting with those who are in person, then who signed up on the sign-up sheet in advance, and then anyone else who raises their hand virtually. If you're attending through your telephone, you can type in *9 to raise your hand. Each member of the public is allowed up to 3 minutes for testimony. We are strict with this time as it is limited in code. Finally, the applicant is allowed 5 minutes for rebuttal, after which the hearing will be closed and the commission will deliberate and render a decision. Mr. Chair, you have the floor.
Thank you, Crystal. All right. We are citizen volunteers appointed by the mayor and approved by the city council. We make final decisions on conditional use permits, variances, and appeals, and recommendation to the city council on subdivisions, rezones, annexations, and code or comprehensive plan amendments. Any decision made tonight may be appealed to the city council, provided that the appeal is filed within 10 days of this hearing. In order to file an appeal, you must have given written or oral testimony at tonight's meeting. So that's why it is important to give your name and address when you testify tonight. We utilize a consent agenda. This means that if the applicant agrees with the staff report and there is no public opposition, the item will be placed on the consent agenda. All items that are placed on the consent agenda are approved with one motion without further public comment. For items not on the consent agenda, we will hold a full public hearing in the order just detailed a few minutes ago with staff, applicant, neighborhood association, and then the public testimony. Thank you all for attending tonight. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Danley.
Here.
Moore. Here. Schaefer.
Here.
Mooney.
Here.
Seha.
Here.
Torres. Doan.
Here.
6 present, 1 absent.
All right, thank you very much. So first order is the consent agenda, pretty quick and easy. Work session meeting minutes and commission meeting minutes from April 7th and April 14th. Are there any questions, comments on any of those? Seeing and hearing none, I'll go ahead and place both on the consent agenda and would love a motion.
Mr. Chair,
Commissioner Moore.
I move that we approve the consent agenda as constructed.
All right, and I have a second.
Second.
All right, I have a motion by Commissioner Moore and a second by Commissioner Seha. Any discussion? Hearing none. Let's go ahead and take roll.
Danley.
Yes.
Moore.
Yes.
Schaefer.
Yes.
Mooney.
Yes.
Seha.
Yes.
Doan.
Yes.
All in favor, motion carries.
Very good. All right, our one and only item tonight, zoning code amendment to modify Title 11 of the Boise City Code for continuous improvements. Deanna, take it away.
Hello, commissioners. I'm here today to present ZOA 25-3 and amendments to the Boise City Code incorporating continuous improvements and permitting tiny homes on wheels. I'm also joined by Andrea Tuning, who will be available to answer any questions. As the application before you is a zoning ordinance amendment, the Planning and Zoning Commission is a recommending body, with City Council providing the final decision-making authority. The approval for criteria for a zoning ordinance amendment is shown on the screen. As background for the city-initiated zoning ordinance amendment, City Council adopted the modern zoning code in June of 2023 with an effective date of December 1st, 2023. At the time of adoption, City Council directed staff to review the code within the first year to ensure continuous improvements. At a February 25 work session, staff presented a year 1 review of the zoning code to City Council, and on April 14th, the same presentation to the Planning and Zoning Commission. The report was also shared as late correspondence last week. In the report, we highlighted that early data suggests that while the zoning code appears to be supporting its intended goals, more time is needed prior to drawing conclusions of trends in most cases. Largely, we found that staff have fielded significant volumes, both in terms of inquiries, with 17,000 front desk calls in the first year, and applications. Nearly 1,000 different applications were submitted. One of the definitive trends we did notice was an uptick in ADU permitting. We saw over a 100% increase in ADU approval from the previous 5-year average. We also tracked how new development and design standards are resulting in the development of infrastructure to benefit our whole community. 1,200 new bike parking spots, nearly 5 miles of new sidewalk, a 1/4 mile of pathway master plan implementation, and over 700 trees. Given the newness of the zoning code, City Council has approved staff's recommended approach for making updates. We have identified 2 distinct types of edits. First is what we're calling continuous improvements, and one of the reasons we're here tonight. These are technical edits that come from a range of sources. They're staff, applicants, public hearings, commissioners, and City Council, and they serve to correct typos, grammar, spelling, and formatting, clarify language to improve understanding, and adjust technical standards to ensure smoother and more consistent implementation of the code. These edits aim to improve usability by cleaning up the language and making the standards clearer and more intuitive for everyone. The second type of edit involves what we're calling policy topics. These are more substantive issues where a change could affect the original intent of the code or are more complex and need further understanding. Because of that, we believe they warrant their own focused zoning ordinance amendment. So this would allow for greater transparency with opportunities for both citywide and targeted community engagement, as well as more in-depth research on that specific topic. And in addition to the edits proposed today, staff are continuing ongoing engagement and evaluation efforts that will inform future code updates. We're working with the Department of Organizational Effectiveness to conduct a post-application process survey with follow-up interviews. Some of our initial findings will be presented at City Council on May 13th. A financial analysis of the zoning code's housing incentives led by a consultant we brought on board. This is also expected to be shared this month. And in partnership with Boise State and the Idaho Policy Institute, we're conducting a study analyzing the long-term impact of the new zoning code on housing supply. Looking ahead, several city-initiated planning efforts will be coming before the Planning and Zoning Commission in the next several months. First, we expect to present the findings of the fiscal analysis of the housing incentive research later this month. In July, we'll bring forward a comprehensive plan amendment in response to the 2024 state legislation requiring counties and cities to renegotiate their area of city impact. Based on the fiscal analysis findings, our first policy topic zoning ordinance amendment is expected to focus on the housing incentives. This will likely be brought forward in the fall, following targeted outreach this summer. Finally, we anticipate a more robust community engagement process over the next year to prepare for year 2 of our continuous improvement package, which is expected to come through spring of 2026. After reviewing feedback and coordinating with City Council, staff have developed a working list of future policy topic zoning ordinance amendments. Given current staff capacity, we recommended to Council that in the early years of implementing the new code, we aim to complete 1 continuous improvement edit annually and up to 2 policy topic zoning ordinance amendments per year. This pace allows us to maintain quality and community engagement as we move through these processes. Given that background on the proposed approach to zoning ordinance amendments tonight, the amendments you'll be seeing before you is the year 1 continuous improvements and an addition of tiny homes on wheels as a defined allowed use. The year 1 continuous improvements edits are just over 140 line items that address a range of topics, but are typically small details as they relate to one of the topics shown on the screen. While the edits to permit tiny homes on wheels create use-specific standards that regulate the design and function of pad sites for permanent parking of tiny homes on wheels within a residential zone. As I mentioned earlier, the year 1 continuous improvements is a list of technical edits to improve code application. These were largely sourced from staff working with the code, interacting with the community as projects went through the development process, identified during public testimony and in coordination with other city departments and agency partners. We added the amendments to include regulations for tiny homes on wheels because of the years-long engagement and pilot process that has been fostered by our innovation and performance team in the mayor's office. Specifically, the recommendation to explore permitting tiny homes on wheels came out of a human-centered design process led by that cross-departmental team of city staff with the goal of finding ways to address housing affordability. The city initiated a pilot in partnership with Leap Housing, and given the lessons we learned through that policy and working with the Idaho Policy Institute, staff made the following recommendations. Since the submission of the zoning ordinance amendment, we received modest public comment. These comments largely focus on the request to change specific policy topics like building heights, parking, and transition standards. We acknowledge the concerns brought up by these policy topics. However, as a goal of this zoning ordinance amendment, we wanted to largely focus on improving inconsistencies and making modifications that improve the technical application of the code. Staff recommended that if the commission and the council would like to address these specific topics, we do so with an individual zoning ordinance amendment so that we can dive deeper into the topic, engage a wider audience. These topics could be added to the list of topics that were shown at the beginning of the presentation and would be prioritized amongst the other policy topics on that list. So the application before the commission is the zoning ordinance amendment, and with the following approval criteria. Staff recommend approval of the amendment with the additional edits identified in the project report. We feel that the application provides the necessary clarity to the adopted zoning code to effectively implement the city's long-range planning goals, and that the allowance for tiny homes on wheels offers additional housing choice. With that, the motion before the commission is a recommendation to City Council. As I said, I'm joined by Andrea and Tudine, and we'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Great. Thank you very much. Andrew, do you have anything you wanted to add now or just in Q&A? Okay. Okay. With that, we have the opportunity for any neighborhood association testimony, and I do see one, I think, representative, but nobody else in chambers, I don't think, signed up for a neighborhood association, right? I don't have any sign-up sheet up here either, so. And I don't see Eric raising his hand, so maybe he's got other things going on. Give him one last chance. Eric? Nobody signed up. Ah, there it is. There it is. Go ahead, Eric.
Hello.
How you doing?
Good. Chair and Commissioners, Eric Berg, 1301 South Branch Ave, Boise, Idaho. When we at the Southeast Neighborhood Association first heard about a cleanup for the code, we were really excited. In January, we'd sent a letter to council encouraging an open process to address inconsistencies, ambiguous, unclear, or contradictory standards, etc. However, when the changes came out, largely as typo fixes and the like, we were disappointed not to have a forum to address problems we see in the code. In regards to the proposed fixes, the board does not oppose any of them. However, the board did vote to express the necessity to build a framework whereby we can address issues in the code where it is not meeting its stated objectives. We've already addressed contradictions with the comprehensive plan and R2 zoning, issues with corner lots and deciding front setbacks in our letter from January, so I won't expound upon them here. However, to add to these issues, we've continued to find other ones in the code, such as with a fourplex plus ADU. Reading the code, a fourplex plus ADU appears to be a 5-unit project, which would activate the multifamily parking requirements. However, it could also be looked at as a 4+ ADU and therefore take the parking requirements from a fourplex. We recently had a project like this in the area where we asked the planner for some guidance and they too were confused. Different parts of code would classify this project under different standards, which makes it hard for developers, neighbors, and even planners to know how to evaluate the project. This could be clarified and fixed so as to assuage this confusion, and these are the kind of fixes we believe we need to focus on. We understand the city not wanting to relitigate a code that has already been passed, but we encourage a process whereby parties can bring fixes to the code that bring it closer to its mission of building a better community through the lens of form-based code. Would welcome the opportunity to work with the city in designing and using said system to make the code work better for everyone. Thank you, and I stand for any questions.
Great, thank you, Eric. Appreciate you coming out and we're testifying online. Thank you. Okay, with that, I don't think there's any other representative of a neighborhood association online or in chambers. So we can go ahead and then transition to questions, or since it is a legislative session, we could also make comments, but try to stick with questions about what's in front of us. So I think that the best way to do this, what I would like to do, kind of a little orderly way of doing it, instead of just kind of going back and forth, why don't we just go down the line? And you thought, see, because you were on the end, Michelle, you were going to get out. I'm going to go first with Michelle. And if you don't have your questions ready right off the bat, that's okay. But why don't we just go from left to right, and topically any questions that you might have that way. I think that would give us a little bit of order. There's probably a lot of things that we want to ask. So if that sounds good, Michelle, or Commissioner Doan, if you have any questions you want to start us off with, that would be great. Otherwise, we'll just go to Commissioner Seha and come back to you. Okay. Commissioner Seha, are you ready? You got some things?
think
Okay,
so,
go ahead.
yeah.
Don't
Thank you,
say
Mr.
Mr.
Chair.
Commissioner, just keep on going.
Okay, so I'm going to start out with the tiny homes on wheels on page 228. So I'm thrilled to see that tiny homes on wheels is proposed as a new use in the code. I'm a little bit confused as to why the planning department decided to identify tiny homes on wheels as an allowed use in the use table for A1 and A2. Like, I can see A1 based on like the description for open space in that original section of our code, but I'm not sure about A2.
Commissioner Seha, we aligned it with permissions for accessory dwelling units. So where you could have accessory to a single family home, that's why we added it there.
What do we usually Mr. Chair?
Go ahead and keep on
Follow
going.
up, sorry. What do we usually have in an A1 or A2 zone? Because I think it's identified as open space.
Yes, so our A1 and A2 zones, they're actually serving multiple purposes, and there's a whole thing. We actually carried the existing A1 and A2 as in its entirety over from the old code into the new zoning code. But typically it's going to be in some of them, it would be open space. Sometimes it's a holding zone until a rezone happens. However, you are allowed to do a single family detached unit there. And so we did align the tiny home on wheels to be accessory to be able to be accessory to that.
Okay. And I will continue, Mr. Chair.
Mr.
I have
Chair.
just a couple more.
Mr.
Um,
Chair, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Go
Should we interrupt if we're on the same topic and add a clarifying question?
Yeah, if it's on the same, might as well.
So South Cole neighborhood, question for staff, South Cole Neighborhood Association, their input was they're looking for removal of residential zoning in A1, A2. So question to staff, why would we not do that?
Commissioner Mooney, for the specific of adding tiny homes on wheels, we again aligned it to what is currently allowed, which is an accessory dwelling unit is already allowed in the A1 and A2. So we used the logic of maintaining and treating the allowance for tiny home on wheels exactly as accessory dwelling units are now. I think that there is consideration to completely look at the A1 and A2 zones differently. But that to me would be a policy change to remove the ability to do residential. It would be a bigger discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure. Commissioner Seha?
Mr. Chair, so second question for staff is, vehicles, equipment. So on page 253 of our packet, vehicles and equipment sales, rental, leasing, light and heavy. So there, what the planning division is suggesting is the removal of the following sentence. The use shall not be located within 300 feet of the residential zoning district. And when I go to the use table, vehicle and equipment sales, rental, leasing for light is allowed in the MX2. And so I'm just curious, I mean, MX2 is not just residential, right? It's a mix, but I'm just curious why the city is proposing removing that sentence.
Yeah, so I think when in practice, we realized that that would make it almost impossible to cite that use anywhere, and that we had all the other standards to address impacts of adjacent. So we decided to remove that. And especially because, as you know, noted, MX2 does permit residential, so then prohibiting it being adjacent to a residential. Does it say zone? Yeah, so to prevent it from being adjacent to a residential use in a zone that permits residential kind of seems contradictory.
Next question is on page, I think it's 402 or 403, and I'm just curious why we removed, or the proposal is to remove noise from chapter 11-04.
I knew you had a packet on that one.
Good evening, Commissioners. For the record, Andrea Tuning with Planning and Development Services. We did go ahead and remove the noise section from the code, specifically because the code enforcement officers typically have not enforced noise. And that is because noise is located in Title 5 rather than Title 11, which is the zoning code. And so because we don't have really enforcement measures, it's not located within our section for them to be able to enforce. They have asked us to remove that.
Okay, so maybe I have kind of a dumb question. Is when we have concerns about noise, we're just going to look to Title 6.
You're going to go to Title 5
Title 5,
for
okay.
that. But like if we had a particular complaint about noise, we would call law enforcement because that is specific to their title. So they would be the enforcers of that rather than a code compliance officer.
I have one more and then.
Yeah.
So on page 428, under notices, mailed notices, there's a strikeout where we're proposing removing mailed notices for certificates of appropriateness and reclassification of historic resources. And I know, like, you know, when we have public meetings or even just depending on the community, we hear from folks about not being notified. As a matter of fact, I think there was a comment that was submitted from a neighborhood member saying, who was on the association, I think, who said they hadn't received notification of the changes in this meeting. So I was just wondering if you could clarify on this particular piece.
I think the letter you're referring to is from Fred Fritchman, because I was going to ask the same question. He was very specific in his letter about finding out, and he's about as tapped in of a community member as there is.
I can address the question about notification. That I would ask about that, and I think it was from the Depot Bench. Actually, was the comment, not from Fred Fritchman. And we have transmittal. You saw it in your packet of us transmitting to all neighborhood associations, like we do for all zoning ordinance amendments. So that is aligned, and we sent it actually over to basically any agency. We transmitted that.
So what about the question about removing the mailed notice first? Oh, okay. I apologize.
That's a very specific application to, and I would just double check.
Okay, thank you.
Do you know the page number of the PDF? So not your full packet. if you see it on the red line.
So not the full packet?
Like in your red line document.
I think it's on page 367.
Oh,
of the
yeah,
code.
sorry. I was looking at the total PDF, total page.
I think I just heard my free dinner.
Don't get cocky.
Huh?
Don't get cocky.
One more time. So the classification of a historic resource.
I'm just wondering why. Looking at.
Yes, we're just trying to find that page. You should hear Andrea's computer thinking. But I'm just gonna find it in the code. I'm not seeing.
I could have been wrong.
Yeah, can we get
Yeah.
back to that? Can we find that? Thank you.
Is that the right page? Is that the right one?
Oh, certificate of, okay, I found it. So actually that removal is expanding the notification. So we're now, instead of calling out the whatever, historic reclassification, instead of saying you only get adjacent, it's going to follow the tradition, the noticing procedures that are above.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Mr. Doan, you have some questions now? Go ahead.
Thank you. So on page 95 of the zoning ordinance, which is page 156 of our packet, item C, there was some language taken out. When I read through it, it looked like it was defining density to reduce the CUP considerations, and I just wanted to know if that's really where the thought was behind that change, the redaction of the item at the end there.
Okay. So this is in reference to the airport influence area, and this was from a project application we received, in which it was ambiguous on how to define maximum density. And so we did put in a criteria of if you are within these activity centers, you can exceed the, you can provide density.
And then one more.
Go ahead.
I gotta find it again. Okay. One of the comments that we had received talked about the transition from a single family home to and so in reading page 154 of your zoning, of the actual zoning ordinance, or 215 of our packet, there's some G and H talk about, I think that whole section from G on, talk about balconies and the layouts of the triplex and fourplex and duplex. Does this begin to address the issue that that neighborhood had?
Commissioner Doan, this is specific in the duplex, triplex, fourplex standards. I want to make sure I'm I know that. So this is not going to 100% address that concern. Some of those would be around building heights and then neighborhood transition standards. So that would be a dimensional standard where the heights would come in, and then the transition. So if you're next to this, then you need to do this. And those are a different section. However, we did add in the duplex, triplex, fourplex standards more clarity on our intent to make sure the design of those buildings they're of the highest quality that we can imagine. And that especially a lot of those edits, if I'm tracking them, they're around building placement, door orientation, courtyard, so that you're having like yards with like yards. So there are some definite design standards that would improve, in our eyes, livability to be adjacent to those.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Real quick, before I go to Commissioner Schaefer, Eric Berg, you still on the line with us?
I sure am.
There we go. Eric, real quick question. Since Fred Fritchman is in is a part of SENA and you obviously communicate, I'm sure, quite a bit with him. I'm curious about your general thought on the notification of this. He seemed to have some, fairly strong opinions. I'm curious, what was your experience with this?
I think that there are still people falling through the cracks on notification. I think looking at our radiuses and also specifically in areas that have non-grid systems. So the example I'll give is along Boise Ave, we recently had a project. And because, some of those lots are triangles, a lot that you might think is, well, it's obviously adjacent. It's, across the street and 2 feet this direction, did not get noticed because it's not considered adjacent because the property line technically misses the other property line by, a couple feet. So we may need to look at stuff like that. I'm not as familiar with the exact one that he's bringing up, but I have noticed there being some places where I think people are falling through the cracks on noticing that would be definitely worthwhile taking a look at.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eric. Mr. Schaefer, jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, Deanna, I'm just understanding process here, a lot of specifics, about what's per se written tonight. I suppose, you look at a lot of the comments we received in our correspondence related to building heights and setbacks and, transition zones, like we were just talking about a little bit. So I guess my question for you is, how do you see that playing out in the future when we get around to that deeper policy discussion, and when does that happen? Because, the list you put up in your presentation looks great, but there's definitely some things that I think that we've been hearing and that we get comments on that wasn't on that list. So have you talked to council? Have you guys had that discussion about when that occurs?
Commissioner Schaefer, yeah, I think that's a great question. And I would say the amendments you see before you tonight are very much based in staff's ability to move through a brand new code in its first year. I mean, in August, we started pulling a list, an Excel sheet of different edits that needed to be made and improved just to make the planners you see here every Monday their lives easier. And so that's really what's being shown here is how do we make it through our first year of a brand new code?
Yeah.
And make sure that it's usable for everyone. But we know there's going to need to be continued conversation. And we felt kind of when coming up with the best approach for zoning ordinance amendments, we felt it would be fair to have these discussions kind of by themselves instead of lumping them in with 140 technical edits where we're talking about a policy change about what is the future height of different roads in our city.
Mm-hmm.
And then also how do the technical, the contradiction between not allowing something happening near residential use when the zone is a residential use. Like the scale is off. So we wanted to focus continuous improvements on this kind of more technical work and then build a working list of topic edits to be addressed. So that list you've seen are already conversations that we have staff have identified and working with city council. I think we'd be happy to hear some of those policy topics to be added to the list, but I think there's a piece of capacity. How many edits can we move through as staff every year? And that has to be prioritized. And we do hope that in year 2, continuous improvement edits, we're expecting to do a more robust engagement around kind of planning values, generally the city we're creating, and then even some of the more technical stuff. But in the year 1 of the zoning code was really like, let's get this working and move that forward and then open up and have a more strategic approach to it.
Sure. No, I think that's definitely fair, right? Like we can't expect you change the zoning code and it takes time for it to go into effect like you're suggesting, but then it also takes time for the community to react to it. So we have to build some things to see how it's working, right? And get that feedback. So I think that's totally fair. I just think that we really need to be mindful, and the city needs to be mindful of those comments that we're hearing. So we're not just kicking that can down the road, right? Because we're starting to see, I think, pretty regularly the same issues. You know, we've overstepped reducing parking allotments, right? Building height transitions are too drastic. You know, things like that we keep hearing that. I agree with you that we need to find the right time to talk about it, but we have to talk about it, right, at some point. So I would really encourage staff to get with council and talk about these things, because these are the things that I think they impact every part of the city and almost every person that lives in the city, right? So I think we really got to keep an eye on those things. And I mean, even Mr. Byrd mentioned that in his testimony, like they're ready to talk about some of these issues that are more substantive that affect everyone, right? So I think that's good to keep that tracking. I'd like to see some of those things move forward. Again, the building heights, reviewing setbacks, some of that deeper policy stuff for sure. That's really about all I have at the moment. I've got some other things that we can circle back on later, but they're
All you got?
yes for right now.
I'm going to go over to Commissioner Mooney, but I would say something very similar real quick. And, Commissioner Doan mentioned something at the beginning of this discussion about, is this all going to come at once? And here we are just on the grammar type stuff, right? Who knows what time we'll actually get done tonight, hopefully not terribly long. But I think, to follow on Commissioner Schaefer's point, you're all going to do it how you think you need to be done and at the guidance of council. But it does seem to me to stand to reason that maybe a different approach is almost every other month, tackle a subject, not the whole code, not half of it or what have you, but like how do we get something changed in incremental periods of time that allows an hour of discussion, but make substantive changes so that at the end of it, in a year from now, we don't have this behemoth of a change that is all coming at once. That's the strategy. That's an internal discussion, because I agree, like the airport influence area, that's a huge topic, right? And one that's going to be, I think, a very lengthy conversation because it does have such significant impact on how things go. I don't know if you have any comments on that. It's just pontificating, I guess. Commissioner Mooney, you want to jump in here?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got notes, but I completely agree with what we just discussed. And I am really curious about how we're going to do this in the city, because this is an immense undertaking, and I just can't imagine how you're keeping all this straight. And Commissioner Danley's comments about doing it incrementally and bits by bit, and then the public outreach announcing, hey, next month we're going to talk about the airport influence area, and then the month after that, and maybe even lay that out. What are your thoughts on that, or does council have a different way of approaching this?
Commissioner Mooney, the challenge with a zoning ordinance amendment is the amount of legislative process that's required. So to do something every other month, you would be noticing nonstop. So I think there's some flexibility, and then we're passing a legislative ordinance every time. So when staff and this is us, who are doing the zoning code edit. So we want to make sure that we're able to give it the attention it deserves and to provide the quality we need. So that's where we came at, that every year we could commit to continuous improvements within the first year, and then around 1 to 2 policy topics. Just even having gone through ZOA 25-2 And then this one following 1 month later, it's a staff lift just to make sure that we're following the public process. But I think there is a strategy and we want to be transparent and we will, coming into year 2, I think our staff have our feet under our ground the ground under our feet with a new code and wanting to commit to a process. For us, a lot of the goals of the zoning code have not changed. And so we are still working to implement the regulations that we saw when we passed the code that implement that. And I think seeing things being built, reacting to that, and that's where that longer term evaluation is going to come in. So we're keeping our eyes on that. But yeah, it is a challenge with the legislative process, but we want to move forward topic edits.
Yeah, thank you for your efforts on this thus far. I know it's been immense, just kind of trying to digest what you guys have been doing. To that point though, maybe, because that was one of the large public feedbacks last year when we heard, this go through the process, and now we're hearing it again on these ZOAs, that the neighbors, the community is like, oh, this is too much for us to review. This is 653 pages of code, and we can't possibly, as lay people with regular other commitments, digest what's going on here and what we think about it. So maybe we give them an early heads up, something beyond the normal noticing that when we do this next review based on your timeline, what are we going to review and how are we going to go about it, so they can concentrate on that and not feel like the whole thing is coming at them and they need to come up with feedback then.
Definitely.
So what I heard was that you've got a working list. Is that correct? So those are, go ahead. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
So this is our working list right now of things that we've identified and heard from, the community. I don't have the newer information we received from the public testimony. And that could be something that the commission can recommend adding to this list. But these are various topics that we're kind of hearing that people would want to explore more and we think would require a more concentrated effort.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I've got a whole bunch of, I guess they're technical, many of them are technical questions versus policy questions. So what's your recommendation, the best way? So I just kind of go through them and get some feedback from Deanna.
Roughly how many do you think you've got?
Probably 15.
Okay, why don't you go through about 6 or 7?
Okay.
We'll go to Commissioner Moore and then we'll go back.
So I'll try to highlight the big ones that have come up, obviously, recently with us. The jail was obviously a big one, EV capable versus EV installed stuff. Where's that in the process?
Commissioner Mooney, that decision definitely came after we had submitted our application. So really the edits to the EV charging section are focused on clarity. We didn't change. I think we provided an actual example within that standard in the red line. So that would not have made it within this red line. Any kind of adjustments to that since the hearing.
Okay. But it's on our working list somewhere. We're going to address it. Also jail related was, in fact, Mr. Moser had many back and forth with the applicant, the county on parking, which was all a function of square footage, which was, was that warehousing? Was that residential? Is that on our list for tackling in a future improvement? Because the jail is kind of a different use.
Commissioner Mooney, I honestly think we could probably address that in a year or 2 continuous improvements. If it were, I would want to talk with staff, but to see if it's just something we have to clarify what is what.
Okay. Got some feedback, public feedback, written testimony on hardship and defining that term. And for years we've, Commissioner Gillespie, for example, he had a very clear definition of what he thought a hardship was. And it was, if you got a flat parcel with no geographic, there's no hardship. But it is kind of subjective. Are we going to tackle that? Yeah.
Commissioner Mooney, I heard from Crystal, there's case law. I would say in this current amendment, we don't have that addressed. And it was interesting to read the public comment on that. But that's something we could explore with a future clarification, maybe tie more closely to that case law.
Yeah, I trust you guys on staff because we've come up with how we deal with it here. So I just wanted to respond to the written testimony. Parking. expound on that, I guess. That's obviously huge. I think Commissioner Danley said we may have overreached a bit.
Yeah, Commissioner Mooney, I think that's definitely something that any edits to that were within the vein of a clarification. I think parking would need to be a larger discussion. There was some very strong, throughout the adoption process, I'll say that our council was very kind of firm on where we landed with parking. And we provided, the reductions we felt were adequate, specifically for the single family home. Some of our multifamily standards were untouched, with the exception of the studio, which I know that was in the public comment. So I think that's something we'd want to play out a little bit more and see how much, when we looked at the report that I sent, I want to say it was about, of the projects that benefited from parking reductions with the new code, half of them took advantage of them, but half of them didn't. So it's kind of interesting to see where that's landing and how it's benefiting people and not.
I'm going to jump in here because I think it's germane to the point. So on this list, I think it's important to note, where are we getting these letters specifically about parking? Most of the letters I seem to read are coming from the general bench area or in the area of Boise State. BSU is not on that list. And the reason why we're getting these letters, in my opinion, is because as time went on, homeowner associations continued to populate, and custom neighborhoods, one-offs, et cetera. That concentration is North End, East End, at the bench, and so forth. So where are we going to see a lot of these changes in whether buying properties, consolidating, get those kinds of things? It's not going to happen in HOAs, right? It's likely it's going to happen in the neighborhoods that we're seeing it. So to me, in my opinion, we got to see from Boise State, what are you doing? What are you doing to help with respect to housing of students? Because that's a critical and a very important topic for the betterment of the vicinity around it, all around that, right? Because again, of what we're starting to see in the letters that we get. That doesn't mean that the transition of some of the housing that we're seeing is bad in any way, shape, or form. But we often hear so many letters about it's all student housing. It's everybody's got their own car. And it's that same thing over and over again, and it seems to be coming from the same handfuls of neighborhoods. So I don't know, is Boise State in their campus master plan? I think, didn't they just update one again, if I'm not mistaken?
I think they are in the process of it right now, and the city has been partnering with Boise State at more of an organization level, and we, work with them closely from a planning perspective. We coordinated with them from a zoning perspective throughout the adoption of the plan. But I hear the concern and the understanding that there is student housing is a very unique student use within these areas, and that it's important to address them, which in the zoning code adoption, and you saw it in your public comments, we did address for the high occupancy housing products, we did increase that housing allowance or the parking allowance.
And students need a place to live too, right? Whether it's on campus or off. And so it's a challenge, no doubt about it. So Commissioner Mooney, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so that was some written testimony, as you alluded to, high occupancy versus high density, and how we can compute those parking problems. So the standard written testimony we see on many of our applications is, if we're not going to, the code's not going to insist on on-site parking, it's going to be off-site, it's going to be on our public streets. Have we thought about a metric, or have you guys, how do we capture that? The public's complaining about this is going to be terrible, but we really don't know. And so if we do this, we implement a few projects, does it really adversely impact the neighborhood or not? Is there a way to capture that?
Commissioner Mooney, actually, that reminds me of some of the work we've discussed with our Department of Organizational Effectiveness when we were pulling up our evaluation plan for the zoning code. And this is something that will take time to evaluate, because we need to wait for those projects to be built. But we've talked about case studies around after a new development comes in, doing surveys. Again, we got to wait for those projects to get built. And but there's definitely something we've been tracking, especially with our Department of Organizational Effectiveness. And we can follow up when they give that presentation at City Council, so that you could follow along.
John, can I hop in real quick? Unless Commissioner or Chair, Mr. Chair, Chris.
Go ahead.
I guess at that point too, Deanna, as we dove into this code update a couple of years ago, I know that we spoke with some peer cities. Have you followed up with any of those cities since we've adopted our code and see what pitfalls they've walked into since they're ahead of us in that process?
Commissioner Schaefer, nothing comes to mind right now. Actually, in the last year, we've had a lot of people reaching out to us, asking us about how our code is going.
Right.
I think we were one of the kind of most relatable cities to have passed a complete zoning code update. You know, some of those other cities you're talking to that we had followed along, those are big cities with really different problems than we have. So
Right.
when the news came out that City of Boise, a mid-sized city in a, not a coastal state, we were able to pass it. A lot of people have been reaching out to us. And so we are on a lot of networks and community
Okay.
of planners. So that's an interesting question to follow up on.
Okay.
And I think
Add that to your list.
Yeah.
Right. Please.
And I do think it's something to just kind of underscore is we want to be delicate with not coming and reversing policies too quickly.
Sure.
Because if we change a policy based off of, less than 500 projects, we might, and, a quarter of those are signs. So think fewer projects than that we had in our first year. It's going to be hard to actually see what was the real impact and its impact on housing supply because we're doing kind of looking at the code and all of the edits we made comprehensively. So that's something we want to balance.
Sure. Of course. Of course. Okay. Thanks, John.
Mr. Chair, yeah, you said 6 or 7, so I think this will probably be at the end of my string here. A question I have about how we're going to address the interagency interactions, specifically the one that we deal with up here the most, obviously, is ACHD and the school district. And we end up oftentimes recommending to council a project without an ACHD report in our packet. That's frustrating because we're really reliant on them for their expertise. Similarly with the school district, if there's a development near a school, safe routes to school, or that we never get that feedback from the school district. How are we going to address those issues? Is that a policy discussion for down the road?
Commissioner Mooney, I would say yes, and definitely something that could be worked on even outside of a zoning code amendment. I would say that's definitely not reflected in the edits you're seeing here and probably would involve work outside of just changing the code. I think Andrew's going to add.
Got it.
Chairman, Commissioner Mooney, just to add on to that, the modern zoning code really implemented what we call the interdepartmental review as well. So that's an opportunity to get together as multiple agencies around the table before a project is submitted. So the hope is that when these agencies arrive at that time, they bring up the issues that we at least have a heads up now that there may be continuing issues, or we can resolve them as we move forward rather than having to wait for them to get a report back because, obviously everybody has staffing issues, volume issues, application issues. And so we're hoping that we can catch a lot of those big things early on. We can work them out through the process. And so now we don't have any surprises at the end any longer.
Right. Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, Mr. Chair, that was one of the ones that we continually, struggle with where we're guessing sometimes what the highway department thinks about an application. And is process wise, is that a good process for us to be considering an application without that information available to us? We're recommending to council, and maybe that report comes in between P&Z and council, and so council's got it, but they really don't have our recommendation means little because it's not informed by ACHD in particular. Do we need to change the process is the question.
Well, we have a lot of parameters that we are working within. So we do have LUPA. So a lot of applications have certain timelines that have to be heard within a certain period. So that puts us in a little bit different predicament than ACHD. They aren't under those same guidelines as we are. So it's really kind of an agency coordination, doing our best. Can we get together early and understand what those issues are so that we can work on them or at least minimize them until we get to the end so we don't have these large issues that are still underlying. I mean, that's our goal.
I'll ask a follow-up question I think is related to this, and that is traffic studies. Because traffic studies is a big reason why ACHD is delayed oftentimes because they require so many of them and the stack gets higher and higher and their staff time is obviously limited. And so getting an application turned around and in front of their own commission, it can take time, but we don't require those types of studies as much as they do. And so, for example, like here we are in downtown. Frankly, if we have a project that comes in tomorrow that's 6 stories, all residential, we're pretty happy with that. I don't know that we really care about a traffic study because what's going to change anyway? We're not going to add any capacity to any downtown street or anywhere nearby. So the question, I guess, is that the discussion with ACHD with regard to, our general thought as a city and the major desire, especially for housing, as it relates to traffic studies and, all of the uncertainties that traffic studies, frankly, often sort of portray moving into the future. So I don't know if you have a comment on that, but I'm just curious if there is even discussion on that very subject.
Yes, Chair Danley, we have talked about that for years and years and years, that traffic studies often look at volume. They aren't looking at necessarily people and practice and actual functions and of how we live. So we have talked about that internally, what we have done. So as you've noted, ACHD often requires a traffic impact study when there's over 1,000 vehicle trips generated. That can equate to 100 residential units or a small commercial development. What we've done internally is if you take a look at one of our checklists, we now say we want to review your mobility plan. So we want to be able to understand what your mobility is, whether you're walking, biking, or in a car, how you're traveling on the site and how you're accessing the roadway. And so that's what's important to us, that we're looking at, more of a people-centric focus and really looking at that. We know from time and time again that widening streets isn't always the answer. Getting an additional turn lane isn't always the answer. Oftentimes that can actually create additional safety issues. And so we have looked at that and we've really tried to balance that. I know the city council has really said that in the past over and over again. We do have a new council now, but my guess is they're probably still concerned with individuals rather than a specific automobile or those types of things.
Thank you for answering that, Andrea. Appreciate it. Commissioner Moore, do you have questions that you wanted to fire off?
Sure. Mr. Chair. So I think mine really fall into 3 general topics. And I think the first, well, before I get into those, on that same similar topic, have you received any feedback about the interdepartmental reviews? Now that you've got a couple of applications that have made it through concept review to interdepartmental review to approval, have you gotten any feedback from applicants about the interdepartmental review process?
Chair, Commissioner Moore, internally, we've heard a lot of feedback that they've been really appreciative about having the opportunity to get together and to talk with refuse collection, ACHD, ITD, all of the key players. So people have been pretty supportive of that. I think we've also heard, the timing of that, there is concerns, you can only review so many meetings per week through those interdepartmental reviews. But I think overall it's been extremely supportive from both applicants as well as the external agencies as well. I think internally, I believe that we've improved. Oftentimes what happens is an applicant will come tell us a story and the story is different when they tell ITD or ACHD, and they have the ability to kind of pit the agencies against one another. Well, ACHD said I could do this, why won't you let me? Or vice versa, the city said I could, why won't you let me? Now we're around the table and we know exactly, what is said, what the concerns are, what the goals are. And so we actually have a goal or an achievement that we can follow and we can all work together to get there.
Thank you. So my questions mainly center around the hearings examiner, ADUs, and the tiny houses. So I'll start with the hearings examiner because it looked like there were some semi-minor changes to that, and I was just kind of curious about those. One of the bigger ones that I noticed was that appeals of certificates of appropriateness and design review, I think they were minor design review decisions, were changed from, their respective commissions to the hearings examiner. And I just was curious why that would be revised.
Chair, Commissioner Moore, that was actually an error when we wrote the code. It was always intended that a type 2 application any appeal would then go to the hearings examiner. And so we went ahead and changed that to really reflect what the intent was, because it was not clear. And then you'll also notice under the hearings examiner that there's the section that, if the hearings examiner is not available, in that case, it would go to the Planning and Zoning Commission, because the Planning and Zoning Commission is the one that ultimately has, given them the powers to make these types of decisions on their behalf. And that's to avoid if there is a vacancy for some reason, if we can't fill that position fast enough, if somebody's on vacation, or if there's a conflict of interest, because, we do have a small development community. Each of you know you've had to recuse yourself, and sometimes that happens with the hearings examiner as well.
That makes sense. And so I'm guessing the other piece of that didn't quite make sense was on our packet page 416. An addition for basically commissions to call for the hearings examiner to meet more often. And I don't know, I couldn't envision a scenario where we would call for them to meet more often. So I was just kind of curious what that looked like.
Chair, Commissioner Moore, that was really a catch-all. So if you do think that, a special work session or something like that would be needed, or, maybe we have a high volume, they could authorize that specifically, so that we have more dates in which the hearings examiner meets. So just trying to think of all the scenarios that possibly could happen and how we would react to those.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you. And then, so moving into the ADU section, I know historically ADUs have been restricted by not bigger than the existing unit on site. And then in the last, I guess, handful of years, we've increased the size from 700 or 800 or 600 square feet to 900 square feet. But now we're restricting them to 70% of the size of the dwelling unit or the 900, whichever is smaller. I was wondering why the specific percentage reduction.
Yes, Chair, Commissioner Moore, we took a look at that, and you are correct that we originally started with 600 square feet. We incrementally moved that to 700, and then with the modern zoning code, that went up to the 900 square feet. As we've been getting things in, we're getting some very large units. And so something that you or I might look at something and say, that is a duplex, just based on the design, because we have one that is 905 square feet and this one is 900. They're calling that an accessory dwelling unit. And so, we actually heard Eric Berg talk a little bit about, how do we create clarity and very clear guidelines of what is something. And so accessory dwelling units are supposed to be essentially that. They're supposed to be accessory to the primary structure. And so we want the primary structure to be the interface to the street or, the prominent development on the parcel, but we want those accessory dwelling units to really be smaller than those units. And so that's where we came to the 70%. We also did some evaluation of some other key cities, and, what is normal. And that seemed to be an accurate number for us.
And Mr. Chair, does that include the revision to the gross floor area that includes the covered area as part of that calculation?
That is correct.
So potentially dwelling units would be even smaller if they had a porch or something like that.
Chair, Commissioner Moore, that is correct, because not only is it the the actual structure that you might live in. It's actually the massing that we have really looked at and said, you know, does that interact with the surrounding parcels? How does that interact with that primary structure? And so we have begun to calculate some of those interior things like a carport or patios, balconies, those types of things.
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Moore.
So on to tiny homes. I guess the biggest thing that I noticed on the tiny homes is just, if we're looking at the table of allowed uses on our packet, page 196, accessory dwelling units are allowed R1A through MX3, conditionally allowed, R1A, not conditionally, but A with the asterisk. R1A through MX3 and then A1, A2, single family detached. I know that it's a little bit different in some of those MX zones with the existing building permit thing, but they're still kind of allowed in even more zones than that. But the tiny houses on wheels are only allowed in, A1, A2 and R1A through R3. Is there a reason why we omitted them from the MX zones? And would it be possible to include those similar to the ADU?
Chair, Commissioner Moore, we did consider that. When we looked at tiny homes on wheels, we specifically looked at where is the appropriate location for them to be. And we thought accessory dwelling units. And so yes, we do have accessory dwelling units that are happening in some of those mixed use zones, but typically those are integrated into the structure, whereas tiny homes on wheels would not be. We also need to have those infrastructure pieces such as, sewer, water, electric, those type of configurations can cause some issues as well. So we really wanted it to be residential in use, and you'll notice that as you read that you can have one tiny home on wheel that is accessory to a residential structure only. So not necessarily in those commercial or industrial uses. We also didn't include them in some of those industrial uses for, equity purposes. Sometimes you don't want to be around those fumes, those noises, those large vehicles, those types of things. So for compatibility reasons, we went ahead and went with the residential zones, R1 through R3, and then we kept the A1 and A2. When you look at kind of how the A1 and A2 distributes throughout the city of Boise, you're going to see Foothills is, a relatively normal one. Areas that were in the county that were annexed into the city of Boise, it was the closest zone that we had available. So we put them in that holding zone, which Deanna had referenced earlier. And then you might see some of those on the outskirts of town, particularly in Southwest Boise as well. So really giving those residential uses the option for that type of accessory structure.
Sure, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Moore.
I think my main concern, and I'm curious the city's thoughts on this. So if you've got what I see happening is you've got your house is zoned MX1 now, and you want to add a tiny house on wheels, but you can't because it's restricted. I think that's probably my concern is, that's limiting a housing type in an area where, you might be able to put an accessory dwelling unit or something like that based on form standards, but you would be restricted to a tiny home on wheels, which arguably is, a little bit more mobile in the event that the lot did redevelop. You might be able to save some materials from the landfill and things like that if the lot did develop. And so it would meet some of Boise's code or Boise's kind of blueprint Boise's topics, I guess. And I was wondering if the city had kind of considered some of those.
Commissioner Moore, yeah, thank you for that feedback. And I think that's something to consider. Again, this was in response to our pilot program, which focused on residential zones.
Well, I've got a couple other minor things, but I think we can move on from me.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Great point. Great point. I'm going to ask a couple quick questions, Commissioner Mooney, and then I'll pop back to you. Okay. I'm gonna real quick refer back to the late correspondence memo that was part of the presentation that was made. A couple of things that stuck out to me, and I was just curious if you can answer this. One is, so if I recall correctly, a little over 1,000 units, I think it was last year. And what's really struck me was 2 years prior to that, it's 3,500-ish or give or take. So it makes me think about the community housing needs assessment document. And if I'm not mistaken, that number now is approaching 30,000 housing units needed to actually bring us into sort of stasis, if you will. So my question is, what is the number roughly that we need to be hitting on an annual basis to tackle that 30,000 over, say, roughly a 20-year period of time?
Commissioner Danley, yeah, thank you for pulling that up. And I think the report that you're referencing, on page 2, it's the 1,300 units. We are striving for 2,000 a year. That's kind of what our established housing need is, plus or minus. I don't have the number memorized. So yes, we're looking at that. In the presentation I gave during the work session, I had a refined graph from this report that actually included entitled units from the legacy zoning code. And I think that's another thing to underscore why, we're taking this more modest kind of tactical edits, is that we're still in 2024. I think we approved 400 legacy zoning code units. So that number is slightly higher when you take the legacy code and then the new zoning code.
Okay.
But yeah, we need to address our housing need. And I think looking at our zoning code and creating options for that housing supply is something that's very valuable to the city. And we'll be kicking off some planning studies to make sure that the allowances we provided in the zoning code and what the market is willing to provide could actually meet that housing need. So doing a little bit more refined study to tie that together. Again, that's going to be more planning work versus zoning, but we would be moving that forward.
But I think I heard you say roughly 2,000. And so if we have a year that's 700 short, that makes the next year 2,700, right? So yeah. Okay. A couple of other quick things is that, boy, I noted in that late correspondence, our tree program, to me, it's particularly of interest. And I noticed that it struck me though, that the dollar amount in that tree program was like 43,000 or something like that. And it provided the planting of, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was like something like 1,000 trees, and it came something like that. And the number came out to be like 3,000 something per tree, is if you do that math. And I was curious, why? Why is it $3,000 a tree?
I think it was 140 trees.
Over 40, maybe that's what it was, but
Yes.
over 40 something $1,000. So that's where I'm coming from with that number.
Commissioner Hanley, I would have to follow up.
Okay.
That number came from our community forestry team. And so that's what they've been keeping track of, and that's what they'll tell us.
I trust our community forestry program. They go to help sort of answer your question. I think the going rate for just the tree right now is somewhere between $400 and $500. So typically, when in my day job, when we're planning this out, it's like we just double that number.
So that's what I thought it might have been.
Right.
So this is
So it's
also
like
accounting for staff costs and stuff like that. That's what I was thinking it was. Okay.
So I don't think community forestry.
It's a money tree. Is what it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Welcome to the struggles of a landscape architect.
They are real. Okay. Another topic here I don't see up here that has been brought, I know, to my attention anyway, and I don't know the validity of it, but I'm just reporting, and I'm sure that you all, I know we've seen it in some of our packets, and frankly, that's the bike parking piece of things. And we discussed it at the work session last time. And so I don't necessarily need to comment, but it's more or less, I think it'd be important to note, especially on the overnight and the long-term parking, like what are those costs and how much of a factor is it with respect to the number of units that might otherwise be built, like especially, or the cost that can then be turned over to a potential resident maybe being reduced. So, because we're looking at like every trade-off we can make right now, because we know that housing is so paramount, right? And as a bike advocate, a little piece of me dies right there, but I think it's important to note, at least explore that as a topic of, okay, what is the sort of black and white of it, if you will. So just a thought there. One other thing, and I'll turn it over to Commissioner Mooney real quick. Page 277 of the actual code, page 329 of our overall packet. It's the TDM piece, the travel demand management section. How many developers are taking advantage of that? How much interest are you actually seeing with this program and the reductions and the incentives that come along with it?
Chairman Danley, at this point in time, we don't have, anybody that has taken advantage of that. A lot of the larger cities, they really focus on those, but we haven't really had any of what we're looking at, large commercial developments. We do have Micron that's happening, but they do have a TDM program already in place. They've got, stipends for, vehicle allowance and transportation allowance, those types of things. So, we're really waiting for some of those larger institutions to come in to utilize those. Because when you take a look at those actually look at, kind of a long-term approach as well. So those are looking at lockers and storage and, really catering to, the multiple modes that you can utilize.
It seems to me like there's opportunity here to align the incentive that comes with the TDM with the possibility, I mean, I think some of us would be interested in the elimination of traffic studies, at least in certain areas of the city. And how do those things come together for, like what you said earlier? Okay, show me how you're going to move people, right? And so all of these things kind of coalescing, like, we don't want you to spend $100,000 on a traffic study that isn't going to be critical in our decision making. We'd rather you spend that money in other ways that maybe, get us another unit or, bike share or something, whatever that might be, so, okay, just food for thought there, I guess. Commissioner Mooney, you have other points? You got a few more, I think.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. I'm actually in the area of impact seat on the P&Z because I'm a county resident, so I'm the AOI guy. So based on that, I mean, obviously our code was written around smart, high density along transit corridors to basically increase our efficiency within the city and disincentivize sprawl. I'm getting a head nod, so I'm guessing I'm on the right track. How are we capturing that is it working going forward? I mean, that's a tough one, isn't it? To figure out how do we are we effectively disincentivizing sprawl, and how do we measure it?
Commissioner Mooney, that's a great question. I think that's one that our planning team, city planning and design, which is the long range planning team. And so when we're looking at impacts of development in the county, impacts of development in our neighboring jurisdictions, really it's a long-term view. It's a regional coordination issue. And then there's some stuff that we can do to educate our policymakers when you're looking at development kind of in the county or on the edge of the city that's going to come in through an annexation. And so as those applications come before us, how can we prepare our council with the best information? And as I mentioned, we are kicking off a planning study to essentially understand how much housing supply did we unlock within the city with the zoning code. A lot of our Compass, which is the regional planning organization, their population projections are all based off of kind of previous zonings. They haven't updated them based off of now. Here we have all of this new allowances within the city. So this is some of the work that we're moving forward when we're not doing the zoning ordinance amendments.
Thank you. Last question is kind of a parochial question, but based on where I live in the city. The specific plans, I mentioned this earlier, our work session. As the specific plans grow, they are really difficult for citizens to interact with because they're already, everything's already kind of there. And so there's very little public interaction with development within a specific plan. As they grow, as we add specific plans, which sounds like we might, is that a policy issue that we should look at regarding how to get the public involved with specifics plans? Because it's basically the city laying out, here's the plan, We don't care what, after you start moving in, it is what it is. Can't do much about it.
Commissioner Mooney, that would definitely be a policy decision to just a general approach to specific plans, generally at the considerations on adopting them, and then building that into specific plans about rules, if that is something the community would desire, which would be that ability to open up. Some of the benefit of a specific plan is that it's already master planned. You know what you're going to get. It's difficult to change. So different trade-offs that, we would want to address with policymakers. And happy to take feedback on that as well as somebody who's impacted by it.
Yeah, and I think that's why I bring it up, is because SPL1 in particular has been great. And I think it ought to be a template going forward. My opinion in how the follow-on specific plans have gone is they've been less and less as robust, and that's unfortunate for the public and the new residents there. It obviously gets the developer some certainty with code, but it's not maybe the best service to the citizens. That's all my questions there, Commissioner.
You just made me think hard about the regional model and the traffic analysis zones and the input that we're putting into that by identifying those zones and the horse trading that occurs between the city of Boise and our regional city partners with regard to the allocation of trips and how that whole thing works. If you hear and you smell burning, it's probably just coming from the inside of my head right now. How has that been received? Has there been, what's been some of the general discussion on that?
Yeah, Commissioner Daly, we've been working with Compass since we adopted the code. Compass is the community planning regional government for the Treasure Valley. And so we're really keeping an eye on the population projections. They do an annual every year. They do a reallocation and equalizing. So they'll look at building permits and test it with, this is very in the weeds, but they'll test it with how many new units have been approved in that TAZ, and they'll realize, ooh, we underestimated here, and they'll actually take it out of another TAZ. So they've been able to find the population and kind of keep it within those transportation impact areas. One of the areas I know that was particularly impacted or undercounted was some parts of the West End, but they were able to modify it from moving things from Garden City. It's all the same traffic corridor. So we're in conversations with them. They're updating Communities in Motion 2055, trying to get some new population projections targeted with that. But again, it's something that the market needs to respond to. We have this new code, so we need to be seeing those higher densities built to then project higher population. So still maybe a little early to really change any regional planning model.
Okay. Thank you for that. I just have a handful of quick comments or questions rather, but they're more specific. They're definitely specific to the revisions that are here. So I'm going to reference some page numbers, so it hopefully will help you a little bit. Page 160 of the actual code, as well as page 506 of the actual code, both have to do with group home. And there being some amended wording there. And I know that there's some sensitivities from federal housing about definitions, like the definition of family and dwelling unit and all that kind of stuff. But I'm just curious, where's the motivation for the change on group home?
Chairman Danley, we took a really close look at this specifically because of the Fair Housing Act and the prohibition of housing-related policies and practices that exclude or discriminate against certain populations. And so when we looked at some of those, we looked at disabilities. Some people look at after incarceration. There's a number of things. And so as we looked at those sensitivities, we didn't want to outright define a specific group. And so we knew that these are individuals, no matter what their ability or what they are living in single family homes. They're living in multifamily homes. They're living in co-housing units. And so we went ahead and just removed those from that and really focusing on the people and the person again.
So basically it's the federal alignment
Yes.
effort. Okay, great. Another one here is, let's see, home occupation on page 165 of the actual code. Like a whole new section kind of popped up on eligibility of home occupation. What's behind that?
Chairman Danley, I think that's specific to is that salons, those types of uses.
I don't see anything that mentions, maybe it's behind, I see it under daycare, child daycare, home occupation. It's the next section after that. So we have section N is home occupation, childcare, and then home occupation other.
Oh. Yes, so Chairman Danley, in that particular case, we did have some childcare regulations that we wanted to take a look at in greater detail. So going up to 12 children. And so that was the allowance for that. And then what are some of those other occupations? So looking at personal trainers and beauticians and piano lessons and those types of things, that those were very, very different. And those childcare home occupations had some different requirements. And so that was why we separated those two.
Okay, great. My last one is page 459, and it has to do with non-conforming uses. And so again, kind of a bigger section of rewrite there. But what I've thought about here is that when we have a non-conforming use, I've seen in other codes where basically we give the owner one opportunity to make a decent sized change to the existing structure despite it being non-conforming. But after that, it's like, this is non-conforming and there's a reason for that. And our objective, the community objective is something otherwise. And so it seems to me, if I read that correctly, we don't really have that. Like if someone's non-conforming, they can kind of keep tweaking it in the non-conforming use that it is, sort of in perpetuity, unless they decided to do something drastically different. Is that right?
Yes, Chairman Danley, our threshold is 20%. So you have the ability to make minor modifications up to that, 20%. Once you get over that, then you have a whole different ball game that you need to work with. So, but yes, you are correct. And that goes with non-conforming structures, uses, kind of the whole gamut of they are non-conforming for a reason. And so we want to make sure that modifications to those are relatively small.
20% of the structure on record, like the original structure on record. If I put in a permit and I change my home 20% and then 10 years later come around and say, hey, I want another 20%. You see what I'm saying? It goes back retroactive to the original deed of the structure or building permit, I would think.
Yes.
Because otherwise I'm gaming it, right? I'm gaming the system that way.
Yeah. Well, and then we also are looking to is it truly that, or is it a variance? Are you going above and beyond and taking a look in that way?
Okay. That's all I had. I mean, there's a few other things here and there, but there's good logical sound reason behind, every one of these. It's just wondering why, really. So any other thoughts over here? Come back. Commissioner Seha?
Mr. Chair, going back to the list of potential future policies, one item that wasn't brought up, but it was on my list is in light of the lithium battery storage application that came before us a couple of months ago, is really figuring out where that needs to be, because I personally don't think where it was identified for the purposes of the application was appropriate, specifically because of the residential property so close to it. So I would ask that be considered on the list of future policy topics and amendments. I agree with my colleagues. I think parking is more of a priority than heights. Because when you look at the heights between the different zones, I think it's about 5 feet difference from, R1A up to the MX. And most of the comments that we hear from folks in-house and written is, we did not buy our property thinking that we would have to deal with something taller next to us. Our city is changing, it's growing. And I'm not saying that just because it's growing, that means that our neighborhoods completely change. But I think that residents, including myself, need to be open to some changes if we are truly going to grow up and not out.
Mr. Chair.
I'm just kidding with you. Go.
Out of here. Yeah, well done, staff. I just wanted to close the loop on a couple of things that I had on my list that came up, right? As we get more into these deeper policy discussions, two that have come up tonight for me that I think the city should take another look at. One is EV charging, and the second is the bike parking piece. And where I'm coming from with this is that I do agree that they're a positive step forward. However, I've heard that the cost of those is a concern from the developers and that side of things. And I'm concerned that we've almost maybe stepped too far, that it's causing people not to want to move forward with their project, right? So I think we want to maybe pull back on a few things here and there, maybe at least take another look at it to make sure that we're getting that positive benefit, but we're not so far that we're pushing people away from doing their projects, if that makes sense. So as we get, and I appreciate, like John brought up the jail, because that came up, for certain at that on that project. So just closing the thread there on a couple of things.
Yeah. Thank you, Commissioner Schaefer. Commissioner Moore, you had something else?
Yeah, Mr. Chair. And I think on the bike parking, I think I said it at the work session before, but especially in these smaller infill lots, you have to put the parking behind and you have to activate a certain percentage of the street frontage and then have all this bike parking on the ground floor, 2 wheels on the ground, that then is storage that's not activated street frontage. I think that is a challenge, especially as I don't know how many of the smaller kind of infill lots we're seeing develop, but I imagine that they're kind of experiencing that challenge of just getting that square footage on the ground for both bike parking and vehicle parking. It takes up a lot of it. So it'd be interesting to see. I mean, even some alternatives to some of that square footage too. That's something I've noticed as well. The final piece that I had was just about the rezones. We had a project that came before us that kind of it was just a rezone, but it had all the stuff to kind of look like a DA. But it wasn't a DA, it was just a rezone. And I think that first created some confusion about what we were looking at. And it also kind of makes it a little bit difficult. I know for me, when you're looking at a building with a height dimension on it, but you're really only commenting on the use or the zone in relation to the surrounding zones, but you see that building with a height on it and it looks like a DA, but it's not. And I'd be curious to see kind of how that works moving forward. Maybe there's a way to ease some of that confusion, and ease some of, what we're reconnect some of what we're looking at to what our approval criteria is. Just to kind of, give us maybe even the avenue to address what we're looking at a little bit better too.
Okay, any other thoughts?
Commissioner Danley, I do have one thing that I just wanted to follow up. Earlier, we were talking about noticing for those historic resources. And so we were focusing on page 366 and we had redlined the removal of that. And the reason that we did that, I did some more research. In the other area, if you go to specific procedures for designation of historic resources, you'll find that on page 440. It actually says that you would notice everyone within 300 feet. So the part that we struck out on page 366 contradicted that, and it said that we would only notice adjacent neighbors. And so we wanted to go with the broader noticing. So just to provide some clarification there.
Thank you for that. One last thing I was going to just add is that, we're seeing in other states anyway, a big push and recognition of the opportunity for housing on religious parcels. And we had an application not too long ago, right, that was in front of us for that very thing. But, again, we're looking for land anywhere we can get it, and we don't want it out in the desert, and we don't want it up in the hills. So where is it? Right. And so I don't know what that might mean in terms of this, but, if there's opportunities to strengthen our code even farther by looking at religious institutions and parcels and allowing them to, add some housing to it, I think that's something that if it's happening in other places, it's something worth discussing here. So just food for thought. But all right, any other questions? Are we good? Okay, with that, thank you very much to our staff. We have 2 folks in the audience. Are either of you wanting to testify this evening? Oh, you've been here for the whole fun time and you don't want to testify. Okay, fair enough. I don't think I see anybody online who wishes to testify. Nope. So with that, the public testimony portion is concluded, and there's no need for rebuttal unless you really feel it necessary. I don't think you need to. So with that, all we need to do is recommend to council what to do with this. So we need a motion to do that.
Mr. Chair,
Commissioner Mooney.
As we went through our discussion, could we go to the slide that actually has the recommendations for our council? So my question is, we kind of talked around some things. Do we want to add anything to the recommendation list beyond what staff has indicated there?
I mean, it's a good question. Do we formally make a note of, specifically maybe the topical issues? But I will say this, the purpose of tonight's hearing is more about the grammar and the change of verbiage, the sort of minor edits, whereas the major ones we know are forthcoming but won't be here for a while. I think staff's done a pretty good job of keeping us up to speed, especially recently. And so I don't know that we need to do that at this point in time, given what's, I think, in more germane is just the draft that's in front of us, and whether what's included in this document that is part of our packet, more specifically, is it in a place that we feel, as it is written here, in a place that we can recommend to council, either to approve or I guess reject, but guessing they're going to approve it with their own changes, of course. But so I would say topically, I don't think we need to do that. That's my answer.
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Schaefer.
I move to recommend approval of ZOA 25-3, the zoning code amendment to city council with all the terms, conditions, and edits as presented to us this evening.
Great. I have a motion by Commissioner Schaefer to recommend approval. Do I have a second?
Second.
Oh, Commissioner Moore, I think you beat her out. All right. Is there any discussion?
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Schaefer.
Since I made the motion, just real quick, I agree with your sentiment before I made the motion that I think that historically, as I've been up here on the dais, that our discussion tonight sort of serves as the record. And I don't think we're at a justifiable point in the process to get maybe down deeper into the weeds and provide additional changes other than what's been proposed here tonight. So I'm comfortable moving forward with what's before us.
Mr. Chair,
Commissioner Moore.
since I'm the seconder, I think the only topic that I'd like to reinforce is just kind of revisiting adding tiny houses on wheels to those MX zones for existing detached dwelling units. Just to kind of align with some of those sustainability thoughts and blueprint policies. That would be my only kind of strong recommendation to city council as they discuss this revision, but I agree with the sentiment here as well. And
Great.
thank you to staff for all the detail.
Yeah, most definitely. I think you took it right out of my mouth. I want to just thank you, staff, and for all the hard work that you've done on this. I know it's difficult and probably pretty thankless, but thank you. And I also just want to thank all of you commissioners, because obviously, it's our job, but clearly every one of us went through this pretty tightly and found, I think, a lot of good information and good thoughts and good provoking, dialogue this evening that hopefully strengthens this code. That's our job, right? That's what we're here to do. And it's certainly one that is important to us. And I know that the council values it. So good job to everybody. All right. Any other discussion, or can we go to roll? Good. Okay. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Danley,
Aye.
Moore,
Aye.
Schaefer,
Aye.
Mooney,
Aye.
Seha,
Aye.
Doan,
Aye.
all in favor, motion carries.
Okay. Thank you all.